Hello, everybody. Welcome to a new episode of the Dissenter. I'm your host, Ricardo Lopes, and today I have the immense pleasure of receiving Dr. Thornhill again on the show for the second time. He already appeared the first time where we talked basically about the evolutionary basis of rape as a reproductive strategy. By the way, for those of us who don't know him yet, he's a professor of biology at the University of New Mexico. But I really suggest that you go and check out our first interview because it's very interesting. And there I give you further information on Dr. Thornhill and other things as well. And so I decided to invite Dr. Thornhill a second time on the show because last time after the interview we talked a little bit more, and because I've already had Dr. Richard Nisbet on the show, eventually our conversation was led to some of his theories about cultures of honor and the differences between the northern and the southern Americans and the differences between them in terms of violence and laws and other stuff like that. And so Dr. Thornhill in his work talks about the influence that parasite-stress might have in certain aspects of human culture and in different cultures, and so we're here today basically to talk about that. So Dr. Thornhill, thank you a lot for taking the time to come on the show again.
My pleasure, Ricardo. Glad to be here.
Oh, great. So, first of all, I think it would be better for people to have at least a notion of what we're talking about here. So, could you please tell us what is the parasite-stress theory of values and sociality about?
Yes, the parasite-stress theory of values is a scientific theory about how people get their values. That is, what causes people's values. And I'll explain what values, what I mean by values in a minute. But it's a proximate and evolutionary scientific theory of how we come by our core values. And basically, our core values are really what we want and need in life. On the proximate causal time scale, what we think is going on is that as people grow up, as kids grow up, they encounter varying levels of infectious disease. There's variation in this. And so some kids experience more infectious diseases growing up than others, and information about infectious diseases in the culture that these kids are growing up in. Some kids have highly activated immune systems as they're growing up because of local infectious disease levels are high, other kids not. And that affects these encounters with infectious disease and in basic information about infectious disease in the culture that the kids are growing up with affects the values that the kids acquire. And it's a strategic acquisition of values, so that if you're a kid growing up in high infectious disease areas, then you acquire values that protect you against infectious disease. If you're growing up under low infectious disease, then you don't need those values. And basically, the values of interest here are on a dimension, it's a continuous variable on a dimension. And the values are talked about in two different ways, depending upon the area of scholarship you're referring to. And in political scientists talk about these core values of people on the conservatism liberalism dimension. So way over on the right, highly conservative, and way over on the left, highly liberal. And it's a continuous dimension of value. So you can place political scientists have worked hard to come up with validated ways to measure individuals' values. You can measure an individual's values and put them on that dimension of values. And it works for groups, and you can get average values for states of the United States, average values for countries of the world, and so forth. Political scientists have done that. Also, from cultural psychology, cross-cultural psychology particularly, the same values basically are called collectivism and individualism. Collectivism being conservatism and individualism being liberalism. So those are the dimensions of values. And basically, if you take conservatism first, and values have received a lot of attention from researchers because, well, first of all, they're so important in human life, and our values, our core values, affect basically everything we do. They're fundamentally our wants and our needs. And so there's been a lot of research, descriptive research on values, how to measure values and so forth, and which values correlate with other values and so forth. Tremendous amount of research. And that research history is very interesting too. We can get to that later. When there were big increases in the research on values and so forth that are interesting. But basically, if you take conservatism first, the fundamental parts of conservatism are as follows. You have xenophobia as part of conservatism, and xenophobia is fear of outsiders, fear of foreigners, fear of people different from you, fear and avoidance, and fear all the way to hate of people with extreme xenophobia, to the point you want to kill them and you don't want to be around them and so forth. High xenophobia, and xenophobia is a continuous variable. It varies among individuals, and the more conservative a person is, the more xenophobic the person is. That's one fundamental part of conservatism. Another part of conservatism is an in-group focus, what scholars call ethnocentrism. So a focus on local, in-group people, preference for social interaction with people like you. They're in-group. They have the same values. They have the same language and dialect and appearance and so forth and so on. That kind of a value system is ethnocentrism. And the higher that is, the more conservative a person is. Another core value of conservatism is what biologists call Philopatry, and it's love of where you grow up, basically. You just stay put. You don't disperse. So that's basically conservatism. Then if you, one more thing I would add there too is traditionalism. So you like traditional things. You want things. You want the status quo to remain. That's very much a part of conservatism too, and that's avoiding new. So neophobia is often used to describe that, and it's really part of xenophobia, because neophobia, new ideas and so forth, come from the outside. So you're avoiding outsiders again with neophobia, disliking new ideas and ways and so forth. So if we take that and contrast it with the other pole of the values dimension, the liberalism pole, you have liberal people are xenophilic. That is, they like foreigners and people that are different from them. And again, degree of liberalism predicts degree of xenophilic, how xenophilic a person is. Liberal people are fine with people that look different, speak different colors, have different values and so forth, more open to foreigners and people that are different from them. The ethnocentrism component differs too strongly between conservatives and liberals. Liberals, instead of being an in-group focus, they're out-group specialists. So they're focusing on people that are different from them and so forth. So low ethnocentrism in liberal people. And in terms of dispersal, liberals move around a lot. They don't mind moving around and traveling and to new places and adventure and all that kind of stuff. Frontier spirit, as some would call it. Um, so those are basically the core differences, and liberals also are much more open to new experiences, new ways of doing things, and so forth. So less conformity and less traditionalism in liberals. So what conservatism does, from the standpoint of the parasite-stress theory of values, is that it protects one from infectious disease. So it's strategic, optimal under high infectious disease to adopt conservative values because the xenophobia, it protects you from diseases from the outside carried by foreigners, people outside your in-group. That's what the xenophobia does. The ethnocentrism gives you all that local social support when diseases come. And the Philopatry is associated with avoiding distant habitats that would have diseases you're not immune to. And fundamentally, the parasite-stress theory of values rests on basic ecology and evolution of infectious disease. And let me explain that briefly. So the way disease-host interactions work is they co-evolve. So hosts are co-evolving with their infectious diseases. Infectious diseases are co-evolving with their host. It's continuous, non-ending, and it's an arms race, an evolutionary arms race. So hosts are evolving defenses against infectious diseases. Infectious diseases are evolving to eat the host despite those defenses, circumvent those defenses. And this phenomenon occurs on a very local level so that you get a geographic localization of immunity to infectious disease. So we are relatively immune to local infectious diseases, but not immune to diseases from over there, outside the local area. And that's why xenophobia is so important in high infectious disease areas, that component of conservatism. It's why ethnocentrism is also important. In areas of high infectious disease, you have all this social support. When diseases come, you can count on your in-group members to take care of you and your family. And why Philopatry is so important. Under high infectious disease, you avoid dispersal into habitats that would have diseases you're not immune to. So it's very much rests on the basic ecology and evolution of infectious diseases. So that's basically the parasite-stress theory of values. And we've tested this theory, and we started coming up with this now about 14 years ago. And by 2008, we published a number of papers in the scientific literature, and we continue to do that, and we continue that research now. But we've tested this in lots of different ways. So basically, if you just take infectious disease number of infectious diseases, that's one variable. And that variable correlates very highly with the severity of infectious disease. Severity of infectious disease is the rate of infectious disease in an area, the portion of people that have infectious diseases. And these infectious disease data are available from outfits like the World Health Organization and other sources that keep continuous monitoring of infectious diseases across countries of the world. And then the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention in Atlanta, Georgia, keeps track of infectious disease levels across states of the United States. So we have these wonderful data on humans for number of infectious diseases and the severity of infectious diseases. And those two variables are very highly correlated. So if you've got a lot of infectious diseases in an area, there you got high severity and so forth. But you can take either variable and then look at that variable in relation to the core value systems of people across countries of the world and across states of the U.S. And these data on core values were not collected by us for the most part. They were collected by cross-cultural psychologists and political scientists. So those are in the literature for countries of the world and states of the U.S. So we put those together. You put infectious disease levels across countries of the world and across states of the U.S. and find that they are very predictive of the core value systems across countries of the world and across states of the U.S. So as infectious disease increases across these regions, whether countries or states, conservatism increases. Said differently, collectivism increases if you're using that variable, which basically corresponds to conservatism. So as infectious disease level declines, liberalism or individualism increases across countries of the world and across states of the U.S. So we provided evidence that we now have an scientific understanding causes of these core value systems that have been important in political science and cross-cultural psychology. That's one way we have looked at it. And others, so once we started publishing this, other researchers jumped in and started doing various kinds of research projects, and including at the individual level. So you can this, what I just described, is comparative evidence across countries and across states about value systems in relation to infectious disease levels. But then experimental psychologists got involved, and you take people into the laboratory and you show them cues of infectious disease in a slideshow, say 10 slides. And these slides are of a person with skin pox or a person sneezing or dirty toilets or those kinds of cues of immediate parasite threat. And what happens is these people become more conservative immediately, more ethnocentric, more xenophobic, and personality changes too in a way that is consistent with the parasite-stress theory of values. It provides basically an understanding of personality variation too. We can get into that later, like extroversion, introversion, agreeableness, disagreeableness, and openness.
Openness to experience, right?
Pardon me?
Openness to experience.
Yeah, that's a fundamental personality thing. And openness is to new experiences is associated very strongly with liberalism. That's been known a long time. And that personality trait. And closed-mindedness, avoiding new experiences, neophobia, basically. Neophobia, fear of new, is associated with conservatism. Yes, indeed. Yeah. And you can change a person's personality in the lab just by showing them the slideshow I mentioned. Yeah. Mm-hmm. So you got that at the individual level working, that kind of research. We didn't do that. Others have done that, and it continues. You look at, show people these cues of immediate threat of parasites, and you get changes in their value system immediately and personality immediately. This research has used good controls too. So, you show people cues of parasite threat. So maybe they're just changing their personality or values because there's some threat, any threat, right? But they've used other threats that show them slides of other kinds of threats, and people don't shift. It's specific. These shifts are specific to getting more conservative, specific to threats of parasites. So that research is very cool. Yeah. And then lots of other research directions too. People look at, so if you show people the slides of parasite threat, their values change in ways that would make them protective against parasites. But also they have their classical, what we call the classical immune system, increases too. Certain aspects of that kick in. We distinguish two kinds of people have two immune systems. They have the classical immune system, which is the old immune system first described by biologists and researched most. It's the T cells and thymus and all that stuff that you hear fundamentally about in immunology courses at university. But the behavioral immune system is the behavioral and psychological features that are as important as the classical immune system in dealing with infectious disease, and values are part of this behavioral immune system. Yeah.
Okay, so you've said a lot of things, Dr. Thornhill, and we have to unpack them individually.
Yeah.
But just before we go through each of them individually, let's just take a step back, just for people to get a wider picture of all of this. Because I mean, isn't it true that all of these, and we're talking here specifically about exposure to pathogens and infection, but there are many other environmental cues. But does this all start from the observation that our minds also are the result of natural selection and also have adaptations, and
Yeah.
then when we are exposed to certain environmental cues, in this case parasites and pathogens and infection, then according to the levels of pathogens in the environment we live in, our cognitive systems perhaps tune to those cues and are influenced by it, and that's at the basis of why we develop certain cultural structures, why we prefer certain political systems, why perhaps in certain countries or in certain regions people tend to have a higher prevalence of certain personality traits and all of those things, right? Because I mean, there are people, particularly the more environmentally minded people, let's say, that tend to think that all of people's behavior in their culture and in their society, all of it comes from socio-cultural factors that have an influence in how they think and how they behave. But I mean, even culture is not something that we can separate from our biology, and it doesn't vary independently from some biological aspects, and it also doesn't vary randomly, right?
Right, right. Yes, I'm glad you brought all that up. So let me go back a little bit and then deal with those important points. So the parasite-stress theory of values is an ecological or proximate theory of values. That is, it deals with the causes within an individual's lifetime that bring about his or her values, the proximate level, and that's exposure to infectious diseases and information and so forth that I talked about. But also, the theory is an evolutionary or ultimate theory of how we get our values, and where that comes in was addressed by your comment. And so the way culture acquisition works is, I mean, the modern theory of how we get our culture, basically, how we get our cultural information, is that evolution by natural selection has built psychological adaptations that are specialized to function in the acquisition of cultural items that deal with local adversity, that impact local fitness effects. So ancestrally, these mechanisms were adaptive in human ancestral environments because these psychological mechanisms guided the adoption of cultural items that work to solve local adversity. And a good obvious example of that is language acquisition. So we acquire the language that is locally effective, okay, that deals with local adversity. So we acquire the language and even the dialect that is important for communication locally in the culture we grow up in. And all other culture acquisition works that way. That's why we have culture acquisition in the first place. It deals with these adaptations of culture acquisition are effective in dealing with solving problems of local adversity. You pull in information selectively, your cultural items, you build your cultural repertoire with items that work against local adversity. And it's the same with values. So you're going through life, and when you're a kid, you acquire the local dialect and so forth, because that's the best social strategy for communicating with people around you. That's the language. You also acquire these values that are effective against whatever the local disease adversity is. So that's the ultimate part of the parasite-stress theory of value, the evolutionary. So evolution by natural selection has built psychological adaptations that specialize in the acquisition of values that work locally to solve adversity. Indeed, and then so then you mentioned too the bigger picture of social structures and all that kind of stuff. I mentioned that you can take people into the laboratory and with slides change their values and personality and so forth, these parasite cues. But also on the personality dimension, we have looked, and others now too have looked cross-nationally at personality variation. So personality psychologists have described personality differences across basically all the countries of the world. Those data are in the literature. And so we pulled those data on personality variation across countries and showed that conservatism or collectivism and infectious disease levels are very predictive of the personality data that have been collected by personality psychologists. And other aspects of social structure, economic stuff, we've looked at, call it the parasite-stress theory of economics, a new theory of economics that deals with some important features of economics. So like diffusion of innovation. Economists have been very interested in diffusion of technologies. So new technologies, do they flow into a country or state, or do they not? So they're classical data sets on the flow of technologies into countries. And countries vary tremendously in whether they have modern medicine or whether they have modern this or modern that in terms of new technologies. And we show that parasite stress is a predictor, a strong predictor, and conservatism and liberalism. So the more conservative the country, the less innovations come in. They just don't like the new stuff, basically. It comes out of that. The more liberal the place, the more up-to-date technologically the country is, the more liberal. And so that's an aspect. And also the wealth disparity is another big issue in economics. Why do countries vary in so much in how the wealth is distributed among people? Why do countries vary so much in property rights and so forth? Who can own property? Why do countries vary so much in these fundamental economic parameters has been a big question since the beginning of economics. And so what's going on is as conservatism in a region increases, then what is also increasing is the attitude of xenophobic and with conservatism you have strong classism too. So a view that some people are just more human than others. That's fundamentally part of conservatism. And high status people are good people, and low status people are bad people. People of out groups are bad, and so forth. And it's fine to disenfranchise them. So you get these tremendous wealth disparities associated with highly conservative places. And economists measure that as the Gini coefficient, G-I-N-I. They measure that every several years and publish data on all the countries of the world and how wealth is distributed. And the more conservative the country, the greater the disparity in wealth. And that's justified in the conservative mind because, these people at the top with the money are just better human beings than the others. That's fundamentally a part of conservatism and xenophobia and outgroup dislike and so forth. So we've done a lot with economics. And then governance, too, across countries of the world has been of great interest to us. So political scientists are very interested in how governance varies across countries. So countries vary from highly democratic to highly autocratic across the world. And political scientists have described that in detail. Descriptive data on how democratic, said differently, how autocratic, because these are on different poles, how democracy is low autocracy, high autocracy is low democracy. These measures for all the countries of the world. And we show that the more conservative the country, the more autocratic the country is. The more liberal the country, the more democratic the country is. And political scientists have 5 measures of democracy, said differently, of autocracy across countries of the world, and they're very highly correlated. But they're stuff like, depending on the measure, the degree to which certain parts of democracy are emphasized, like how widespread is the voting privileges of people in a country, how widespread is health care in a country, how about property rights, how can only the rich folks have property, or can everybody own property? Those kinds of things are part of democracy measures that political scientists have used. So we take all their measures and we show that they all are very strongly correlated with collectivism, more collectivism, less democracy, and very strongly correlated with infectious disease. More infectious disease, less democracy. So those kinds of things we've done a lot of, yeah.
Mhm. Okay, so basically you've done a bunch of studies which allow for us to determine the arrow of causation because, for example, people would tend to think that perhaps other factors like, for example, GDP, and perhaps you could also give us other examples of confounding factors that come into the picture and that people put forth to try to explain several different traits that people have in terms of their political preferences and personality and their in-group, out-group dynamics and things like that. But I mean, you controlled for those other political, cultural and social factors, and the levels of pathogen exposure, that was still the factor that had prevalence over the others in terms of the effects that it had in explaining all of these behavioral variables, correct?
That's correct. So, yeah, basically, that's a good point. So, in the kind of comparative analysis we do, like across countries of the world or across states of the U.S., if we're looking at infectious disease in relation to some variable or conservatism in relation to some variable, we very carefully look at the literature of scholarship in that area to see what scholars have thought is important in predicting, like, democracy, degree of democracy, and so forth. And then we control statistically with standard analytical techniques, we control statistically for those things that the scholars traditionally have thought were important, and show when we do those controls that our theoretical variables of interest, parasites and conservatism, are very powerful predictors, even when those other things are removed from having an effect by analysis. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Right. Okay, so let's talk a little bit more about personality traits now. Because, again, people could say that perhaps it is not really the exposure to certain levels of pathogens that make for for a certain prevalence of certain personality traits in a given area or a given country, but it would be the other way around, that it is because people have some personality traits that they then tend to deal with other people in a certain way. But again, you control for that, and there's a very high correlation between exposure to certain pathogens and to certain levels of pathogens in different areas in the world, and the prevalence of certain personality traits. And by the way, are those personality traits related primarily to extroversion, agreeableness, and openness to experience when it comes to the big five? Is that correct?
Those are the three. Those are the three that are predictable from conservatism and parasite-stress. Yeah. So as conservatism increases, or in parasite-stress increases, you get less openness to new experiences, less. So as liberalism increases, you get more openness. And as parasite-stress increases, you get less agreeableness. Okay, and that's a weird personality trait. We can talk about that. But then you also get, as infectious disease increases or conservatism increases, which is the same thing basically, you get less extroversion, more introversion. And introversion is socially protective. So if you're introverted, then you're less open to, contacting strangers and so forth. That's what that's for, introversion. But agreeableness, and the way, this big five thing, it was not erected. The big five personality taxonomy was not erected from evolutionary theory. It's not erected from knowledge of the design of people's minds. It was erected just analytically. So you take these measures of personality, and then you throw all that together and look at what things clump with the other things, and you get five factors coming out of analysis. And agreeableness is an interesting one in that regard, because what you expect on theoretical grounds when you think about the parasite-stress theory is that conservatives are going to be very agreeable with in-group. They're not going to be agreeable with out-group, right? And liberals, however, are going to be more agreeable with in-group and out-group. So these personality things really need some work to clean that kind of thing up. Extroversion, introversion is okay, because it works fine. And openness to experiences and all, that's basically measuring neophobia or neophilia, degree of that. That one's fine. But really the parasite-stress theory illuminates the need for much more thinking about the kinds of personality traits people have. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. And what kinds of effects do we get when you're talking about people that are part of the in-group? Is it also the case that perhaps when people live in environments that promote a higher number of infectious diseases, particularly from human origin, that even people that are part of the same group also deal with each other differently? I mean, is it, for example, the case that in a situation like that, even if people are part of the same group, that perhaps they have less trust, there's less trust between those people of the same group and other aspects like that?
Right. Those kind of yes, indeed, I agree with you. It's going to affect, if you live in an area of high infectious disease, then that will affect your social interactions within group people as well. As you're going to avoid out group, definitely, because of you have local immunity, but not distant immunity. And so, but at the same time, how you interact with in-group members is going to be affected too, of course, and more caution with in-group members and that kind of thing. Yeah. So when people get sick, they tend to be avoided, and even by in-group members. So yeah, that's there as well. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. And talking about how parasite stress affects culture, would you say that perhaps another way by which it affects it is because, for example, if people are exposed to other people that have different behaviors, different habits, different cultural traditions, that it might work as a proxy for them to belonging to other groups.
Mm-hmm. As a cue that that there's a threat of foreigners there. Yeah. 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 So I mean, if you look at a conservative group, everybody, there's, conformity. That's associated with conservatism. The more conservative, the more they conform. So everybody thinks the same way. Everybody looks the same. Everybody follows the same rules and all. So that's very, any kind of deviation from that is easy to detect. And people will pick up on that and punish or ostracize the person who's behaving in even a slightly different way, like being a little left-handed or something like that. Like, I'm left-handed. Yeah, and their colleagues did an analysis where they looked at handedness across countries of the world. There were like 79 countries where data, there are about 200 countries in the world. So they had 79 countries where researchers had measured from good sampling handedness, and what they found was that the more conservative the country, more parasites in the country, the fewer left-handed people there were. So there's incredible pressure to conform in terms of handedness in conservative countries, and so you don't get many left-handers.
Yeah, yes, and perhaps this is really not a thing that people tend to associate with being exposed to environmental conditions that promote the development of infectious disease, right?
Right, sure, and yeah, all that is outside the conscious realm, of course, of people. They just and basically the way that behavioral immune system works is it overshoots. It accepts a lot of false positives, as we say. That is, it exaggerates in interpreting cues of disease threat, and that's why you get these prejudices, not only toward people that look different, talk different, and so forth, but prejudices associated with conservatism, of homophobia, prejudices against people that are overweight, that are underweight. All that's very strongly tied to conservatism, and in fact, all the prejudices are associated with conservatism. So, and I should add too that somewhere in this discussion, that the parasite stress theory of values is a scientific theory, and hence it doesn't judge people's values. We all have our values, and we judge based on our personal values, but the science itself makes no judgment of a person's values. It just gives you the causes of the values. It doesn't judge them, and it doesn't say that conservatives are more moral than liberals or vice versa. It doesn't have anything to say about that. The science itself. Yeah.
Yes, that's a very interesting point, and I was just about to bring it up. I mean, when we're saying that certain groups of people tend to behave toward out groups or even people from their own group in certain ways, but that perhaps sometimes they are more conservative or more liberal or more violent or less violent,
Yeah.
and things like that, we're not making judgments here. We're just describing how things are, and I mean, even I would say that if people are to pick on these descriptions and say that this is a good thing or this is a bad thing, that then they are committing the naturalistic fallacy, because they are deriving moral values or moral judgments from scientific facts.
Right. Indeed. Yeah, it's important to keep that in mind, and not to make the naturalistic fallacy to deduce that what is true in the world, what is factual about the world, gives you moral guidance. Yeah, that's just not part of the program. Yeah, yeah.
Okay, so another topic that we haven't yet discussed very much today, that is, so we've been talking about what happens with people's behavior in general when they live in places where they are more or less exposed to pathogens and infectious disease. But this also depends on the origins of each infectious agent or infectious disease, because I mean, if they come from human sources,
Yeah.
then the effect is much bigger than when they come from zoonotic sources, that is, from other animals.
Right. Absolutely. That's an important point. I'm glad you brought that up. We've looked at that in great detail. The parasite-stress theory of values is also, we also call it the parasite-stress theory of sociality, because it's a general theory of social behavior. So if you're xenophobic, you're behaving socially differently than if you're not xenophobic. If you're ethnocentric, you're behaving socially different, and so forth. So it's a general theory of social behavior. And so let's see now. Your question was again, oh yeah, the kind of parasite, right? So it's about human social interaction. Parasite-stress theory is about human social interaction and contagion risk associated with human social interaction. So diseases of humans are divisible into two categories, basically. We can talk about them as zoonotic diseases, zoonotic, and these diseases are catchable from non-human animals only. So we get these diseases, these zoonotic diseases, and there are a lot of them, from livestock, from pets, from wildlife, and so forth. That's where those diseases come from. The other category of human infectious diseases is non-zoonotic, and we get those from humans. We get those from humans. We may also get them from wildlife in some cases, but we get them from humans too. So basically, you can break the human infectious diseases down, and epidemiologists do this. You got the zoonotic, you only get from non-human animals. You got the category of that we get from humans, and in that category, you got human specific. You only get them from humans, or you get them from humans and other animals. But anyway, if you get them from humans, then that's what the parasite-stress theory of values mainly talks about. How levels of those, rates of those infectious diseases that we get specifically from humans, or get from other animals, but also from humans, but we get from humans, relate to value systems and these other variables we're talking about, personality, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And indeed, that's what we've done. We separate the diseases into these categories and look analytically at how these diseases predict human behavior and psychology. And we find that the diseases we get from people are the diseases that predict value systems and governance and personality and so on, not the diseases that we get from non-human animals. Yeah, that's a very important point. Yeah. And that controls for all kinds of things. I mean, some people have said, well, if you got a lot of infectious diseases in an area, then basically you've got a lot of other kinds of problems too, right? People are poor, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, and all kinds of problems. So maybe it's that other stuff that's really causing the value variation and not infectious disease. But when you look specifically at the kinds of infectious diseases that the parasite-stress theory of values is talking about and focusing on, that is those we get from humans, and show that those are the diseases that are predicted. The kinds we don't get from humans don't predict these things. They don't predict these things. Then that's very powerful. Yeah.
Mhm. Okay, and what is the main emotion that goes associated with how we react to exposure to certain sources of infection or pathogens? Is it disgust mainly, or can we also consider other things like fear? And I'm asking you this because I then have a follow-up, but if you could please tell us about that.
Follow up with what? I missed something there.
Because the follow-up I have for that is that, so we're talking here about, or we've talked in the last question about exposure to pathogens that have human origins or non-human origins that come from other animals, basically. And I wanted to ask you then that, so we have certain fears that are directed towards certain animals like snakes and spiders that seem to be innate, or at least partially innate, because as far as I know, there have been some studies done on chimpanzees and other primates where they seem to have an innate fear of snakes, for example, but to develop that fear, they have to be exposed to another individual having a fearful reaction to a snake, and that doesn't really work if they see another individual having a fearful reaction to a flower, for example, and that's how basically scientists determine that the fear is partially innate. So I would like to ask you if it wouldn't make sense that, since perhaps certain animals during our evolutionary history could have represented a source of infection, if fear could be another emotion that would already play a part in our avoiding certain infectious sources that could perhaps also apply then to other groups of humans, let's say.
Well, as you mentioned, disgust is very fundamental to the behavioral immune system, and that's the underlying emotion that is varying. Conservatives have more disgust sensitivity. There's been a lot of research on that. They're very easy to discuss. The more conservative a person is, the easier they are to discuss. So they have a high disgust sensitivity, and that's functional for them because that means that helps protect them from potential sources of contagion. But fear too. I mean, you can get. The disgust, you get a little bit of disgust reaction all the way to an extreme disgust reaction where you get the human-specific facial expression of disgust, very strong reaction in the face you can see. But then fear should be part of this too, but not a generalized fear. I mean, you can be fearful of, bad weather. But a tornado or something like that, but a kind of fear. But that hasn't been brought into the research empirically, how fear may interact as a protective mechanism against infectious disease. Yeah, independent of disgust. Yeah, because when you get disgusted, then it may evoke fear toward whatever's disgusting you, and you want to move back from it. Yeah.
Okay, so I would also like to ask you if it makes sense for us to think that perhaps we haven't really developed an innate disgust toward certain animal species, like for example the ones that we have domesticated since the advent of agriculture, because since we've only had agriculture and domesticated species for perhaps around 10 or 12,000 years or something like that, that perhaps it is too new in our evolutionary history for us to have adapted to that in terms of also feeling disgust toward certain animals. Because, and I'm asking you this also because we know nowadays that certain diseases that really affected people and that now we have a certain immunity to them, at least the peoples that lived in close quarters with certain animals like the pigs, the cows and other animals like that, that perhaps since it is too recent in our evolutionary history, that might have been a reason why we haven't really developed disgust toward those animals, even though they have transmitted certain diseases to us.
Yeah, I think that's complicated. I mean, the pigs and the cows and all that provide benefits. You eat the meat, right? So it may be a benefit cost kind of thing, even though, but and the time scale too is relatively recent for domestication as well. That's certainly a factor. But then you have the vegetarians and vegans too. You know, what's going on with them? It's not, they would say it's not a disgust reaction as to, or maybe it is. I mean, do they get disgusted when they think about eating meat? If so, maybe that's a bit of a specific response to domesticated kinds of animals, kind of meat. I don't know. It's complicated. Yeah, it's interesting.
Okay. Okay, so let's go back to the relationship between parasite stress theory and philopatry, because I would like to ask you, since you talked about movements of people from one group to another, if parasite stress theory also predicts how people move nowadays from, let's say, for example, one country to another, or one region of a specific country to another.
What we've done with the Philopatry component is this: we looked at what anthropologists call home range size for ethnographic societies in the anthropological record. And there's a data set of 339 anthropological societies that pull together, compiled, and with all kinds of variables measured in these by anthropologist by the name of Lou Binford long ago. So he had home range size on all these things. So we predicted that the more parasites in a region where the indigenous society lives, the smaller the home range, as kind of a surrogate measure of dispersal. If it's a small home range, then the people aren't dispersing as much as if it's a big home range. And so we did that analysis and showed that it works. That is, more parasites, the smaller the home range of the people across these 339 indigenous societies. We did that. Then we did another thing where we looked from the U.S. Census Bureau. They send out every 10 years they do a census over here in the United States. And you're supposed to fill these. It's a pretty good sampling procedure. They kind of threaten you. They say you got to fill it out and send it back. So it's a pretty decent sampling method. But there's one question on it that we focused on in the last census, which was, have you moved from your state to another state since the last census? So that question of whether you've moved to another state since the last census. And we predicted, of course, more movement the more liberal the states were, or less movement, the more conservative the states were, the U.S. states. And that worked very well, too. So people are moving more in terms of at least between states. So we did show in that analysis that, for the 50 states of the U.S., that the more conservative the state, the more people stay home. They don't move to other states. And the more, said differently, the more liberal the states, the more people. That's one way we've done it. Let's see. So we did that. We did those things. And there's some other hints in the traditional psychological literature that would support. I know a really cool one. There was a guy named Carney who did a study. He went in. He was interested in this, not from the standpoint of the theory. He just had a sense that conservatives don't move around much, and liberals do more. And I mean, Mussolini. Go back to Mussolini too. He said the problem with liberals. He hated liberals. He was very conservative. His problem, his fascist. It's as conservative as they get. The problem with liberals is that they move around a lot and they bring in diseases when they move. They move around and catch diseases out there and bring them back. So Carney, he did this study where he went into the homes, had a big sample of people, conservatives and liberals, went into their homes and asked them about their traveling, traveling around the U.S., it was U.S. sample, or around the world, wherever, and examined their homes for travel paraphernalia. So all kinds of things, travel souvenirs and all that kind of stuff. And he showed the more conservative the person, the less traveling they had done. And so that was kind of a cool study, too. So there's evidence for the Philopatry, certainly from various levels, but the individual level and the ethnographic societies and so forth and so on. So on the collectivism and parasite-stress, I didn't mention, I focused on across countries and across states in the U.S., but an anthropologist, Elizabeth Cashton, did a very interesting study. She went in the ethnographic record of anthropology and coded degree of collectivism across societies there in the ethnographic record. I think she had 186 societies that she could code degree of collectivism on. And then their parasite stress scores are available for all those ethnographic society locations from work that Bobby Lowe did and Elizabeth Cashton too. And so parasite stress predicted collectivism for the ethnographic society as well. It's not just U.S. states and across countries. It works for ethnographic societies too. So that's powerful comparative stuff. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so I would also like to ask you, was it the case that in all of these studies that you've been talking about, people also controlled for IQ? And I'm asking you this because one of the factors that go into the level of IQ that people are able to reach also has to do with, for example, if they are exposed to infectious disease that affects their neurodevelopment, then they might get a lesser score on their IQ scale, let's say. I also want to ask you about this because it seems to me, at least, that IQ is highly correlated with things like openness to experience, at least in the aspect of being open to new ideas. Right. And so, yes, and the other factor would be that one, the fact that people are more open to novelty and new ideas and things like that.
Sure. Yeah, that's a good part of this story. Actually, we did a lot of research on IQ variation. IQ has been a big topic in psychology for a long time, and so trying to figure out how to measure it, and measuring it across states, across countries, and so forth. Big deal in psychology. But why does it vary so much is a question we were interested in. Why does it vary so much among individuals, among groups, among states, among countries, and so forth? So there were all these data across states of the U.S. and across countries of the world on IQ variation. And we thought that what's going on potentially is that it does relate to infectious disease in that to build a quality nervous system, big brain and so forth, which would promote IQ, takes a lot of energy. And also, your immune system is huge. Okay, it's huge, and it's going to be very costly as well to maintain. And we figured those two things would trade off. So, under high infectious disease, you've got to make a good immune system, both classical and behavioral immune system. You got to make that, or you die under high infectious disease. And that's going to trade off with the energy and tissues that you have available to make a quality nervous system. So we anticipated that infectious disease levels across countries and across states would correlate with IQ. More infectious disease, lower IQ across countries and states. And we tested that. And remarkably, the correlations were extremely high. Between infectious disease and IQ, conservatism and IQ. So the more infectious diseases, the lower the IQ. The more conservative, the lower the IQ, and that we think is due to the trade-off between making a good immune system and a good brain, basically. But it's like. Some have said, okay, and I think it's depending on the view. So if you take a liberal person, they just think that this conservative stuff, like what the Ku Klux Klan does and all that extreme conservatism, fascism, and all that stuff, is just crazy. And these people aren't very smart. Okay, they just don't have sense enough to know better. That's a common interpretation I've run into when I talk to liberals about this work. They're just dumb. But it's not just that, okay? Because xenophobia, the hate, dislike, avoidance of out-group people, is very strategic for these people. So it's not simply that they have low IQ and therefore they hate people different from them, and that's all there is to it, Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so now let's move on to talk about a more specific topic that is the one that I referred to at the very beginning of this interview, that is the differences between people that live in the southern United States and the northern Americans, let's say. So we've already talked about things like conservatism and liberalism and how people, and in terms of also philopatry and ethnocentrism and things like that. But I would like to ask you if Parasite-Stress theory of values also does a better job than perhaps explanations that have been put forth by people like Dr. Richard Nisbet and others when trying to explain differences in terms of people resorting more or less to violence to solve social conflict, and also perhaps levels of religiosity and also support for gun ownership and being against gun control and other factors like that that really differ between northern and southern states of the United States.
Right. Yeah, that's a topic we spent a lot of time on, actually. The culture of honor, as Nisbet called it. And in short, the culture of honor is just collectivism. It's conservatism, culture of honor. And the valuing and reverence, really a reverence almost of in-group people, to the point where, and you're tied to them. So conservatives have a different conception. Let's start here. Have a different conception of self than do liberals. That's been known a long time in psychology. So the conservative self is not an independent individual. It's an interdependent individual. So the conservative self sees self strongly related to the other in-group members, so the extended family and so forth. It's not separable from that. The liberal self is an individualism, a separate entity, okay, that thinks on his or her own, acts on his or her own, doesn't need permission from the in-group and so forth. Whereas the conservative is tied in decision-making and thinking to the in-group. It's an intellectual interdependence that the conservative has, whereas the liberal is intellectually independent. So if you insult a conservative, you're simultaneously insulting that person's mother, father, grandfather, in-group, the whole thing. Because that person is part of all that and reveres all those people because of the strong social size associated with ethnocentrism. As a result, if you insult that person that way, that person's going to get mad. And that can escalate all the way to lethal violence. That's why you get such high homicide rates in conservative places. It's not just the southern United States. If you look at homicide rates across countries of the world, they're correlated very strongly with parasites and conservatism, positively correlated. So the culture of honor, basically, this whole honor concept where you honor your family, you honor your in-group, and if somebody disrespects you, you take action against them, and you can escalate in that action and kill them, and so forth and so on. All that is coming out of conservatism, and so so Nisbet. I mean, they very nicely show, Nisbet and colleagues have shown that the southern United States has very high culture of honor. They show that very well. But it's not specific to the United States. It's the U.S. South. It's wherever there's conservatism, we show. And so what we looked at, one thing we did, Nisbet and colleagues have emphasized how the culture of honor is associated with high homicide rates, especially male homicide. And so we looked at homicide data across states. We did that analysis first, and we went across nationally too. But across states of the U.S., the Parasite-Stress, turns out, is the best predictor of rates of homicide across the states in the United States, best known predictor. Prior to our work, the best predictor was the Gini coefficient in a state, so the degree of wealth disparity, which makes a lot of sense. So if wealth's disparate, then you got a lot of these disenfranchised males who are in fast track and they're taking a lot of risk and so forth, and they engage in more violence, and you get escalated violence all the way to murder. So Gini is a factor, but we partial out Gini and show that parasite-stress is the best predictor of homicide rates across states of the United States. So it's a serious matter in homicide research now. Infectious disease and conservatism, how that impacts homicide rates. And it's basically that if you disrespect a conservative man, you are disrespecting his granddaddy, his great-granddaddy, his uncles, his sisters, his mama, everybody, and all his friends, and everything. That's why he gets so damn mad. I grew up in the old South, in the heart of Dixie, Alabama, and culture of honor was everywhere. It was those people fascinated me, and that's one thing I think that led me to this research on values, trying to figure out how those people got in that shape down there. Because I'd often tell them, what is wrong with you people? And finally, I just started observing them, studying them. Yeah. So that's what the culture of honor is all about. I mean, there's also this family honor component too, where it pertains to the female honor aspect. Female honor in conservative cultures is to protect the jewels and do what Daddy says. So Daddy owns you in a conservative place. Daddy owns the girls, and then that ownership is passed to the husband when at marriage from Daddy. But the girl is supposed to obey Daddy's rules and so forth, and not engage in any sexual behavior. If she violates that, then she dishonors Daddy and the family, and you get these extreme cases where the girl is killed and so forth in very conservative places because of her dishonoring of the family. That level of honor, that type of honor too, is very much associated with conservatism. And so we looked at all the homicide stuff cross nationally, across states in the U.S., and everything works beautifully in light of what we're talking about here. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so I've also asked you about levels of religiosity, but perhaps it's even more interesting to get more specific here and talk about specific contents in terms of directing people's morality and people's behavior when dealing with people from in-group and out-group and things like that, that creep into many religions. So, for example, I think that it is very interesting that there are a lot of religious rituals that use water, and water is associated with something that cleans, that rids people of infections and contamination and things like that. And perhaps there are a lot of rituals that are associated also with purity and with separating categories of peoples and things like that. And also, since we're talking about exposure to infection, there's a lot that goes into religion that has to do with sexual behavior and avoiding being promiscuous and other stuff like that. So that also comes from parasite-stress, right?
Yes, indeed. We have looked in detail at a couple of different aspects of the religion issue. One is religion scholars measure degree of religiosity, and so religious commitment and participation of people. It varies tremendously. Of course, it varies across individuals, but it also varies across regions of the world, states of the United States, and so forth. And religion scholars have been very interested in measuring this religiosity, religious commitment, and participation. There are data in the literature on all the countries of the world, the states of the United States, and so forth. They're religion scholars. And we figured that religiosity as a component of conservatism would be predictable from the parasite-stress theory. So parasite stress, as that increases, you should get more religiosity. And we tested that against the data in the literature provided by religion scholars that they've accumulated there, and showed that that is true. That is, the more infectious disease, the more religious people are, both across countries of the world, across states of the U.S. And religion, what it does is it serves the ethnocentric part. So you get an in-group focus associated with religion. And the more religious, the more in-group focus and less out-group interaction there is. And it also gives a boundary. I mean, religions are defined by religion scholars as a group over here believes in a particular God, and this group over here believes in a different kind of God. And that's a significant difference to the people. They differ in this belief. So it creates a boundary, religion does, and that serves the xenophobic aspect of disease disease worry and avoidance and so forth. So, yeah, we showed, this provided a new theory of religion. It's parasite-based, basically, and value-based. And that's one thing we did with religion. And the other thing was religion scholars have been interested in why regions of the world vary so much in number of religions. So if you look at some countries of the world, you'd have, hundreds of religions in the country. Other country, 10 religions, like Norway and Sweden and so forth. They don't have many religions. But if you go down to the equator, you got lots and lots of religions in those countries. And most of these religions, most people have never heard of. You'd have to be a religion scholar to even hear of. They're minor religions, but very important to the people that have them, of course, even though they're minor in terms of number of participants. But religion scholars have tabulated the number of religions per country, and we took those data and showed that the more parasites in a region, or the more conservatism in a region, the more religions you find. And that's an aspect of the theory, that pattern is an aspect of the theory, parasite-stress theory, we haven't talked about, which is that it's a theory that generates new cultures. So basically, if you have a culture in a geographic region, because of the xenophobia, ethnocentrism, and philopatry, you get a localization and a fractionation within the big culture. You get a fractionation, and you get boundaries and so forth, and you get new cultures arising. So the parasite-stress theory is a theory of the genesis of new cultures, and we looked at that aspect of the theory by looking at the number of religions across countries of the world and the number of languages across countries of the world. Linguists have been interested in that too. Why some countries have so many languages and other countries don't have any language. And we showed that parasite stress and conservatism predicts the number of religions and the number of languages across countries of the world. Yeah. So that's going on out there too. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so now let's talk a little bit about how parasite-stress theory of values also might help us explain certain historical phenomena and things like that. So I would like to ask you if you think, or if there's evidence that perhaps the fact that the Inquisition was created after those several waves of bubonic plague that went through Europe and that really wiped out a lot of people. In certain places it was a third of the population, in others I think it was 2/3 even, so really a lot of people, that perhaps because the Inquisition seems to have been developed right after that period, that perhaps because people were exposed a lot to infectious disease, that it could explain the timeline there, and perhaps why certain religious practices followed up from those events in Europe.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Very much so. These events, major events in history, the Inquisition, the Enlightenment, the Cultural Revolution in the West in the 60s, all those kinds of things, liberalization of values in the 60s in the West, all that stuff's been very interesting to us. And we can start picking away at that. The easiest one to talk about in detail, because it's more recent and we know more about it, is the Cultural Revolution in the West in the 1960s. And then we'll go to the Enlightenment and Inquisition, go back in time. But the Cultural Revolution in the 60s and 70s in the West has attracted a lot of attention from historians, because God, all of a sudden people got liberal. In general, people got liberal. They got against the war, against government. free love, all that kind of stuff. Sexual attitudes were liberalized, and general attitudes were liberalized. You had the feminist movement occurring in the 60s and 70s, female power, racial minorities began to be viewed more positively. All the disenfranchised groups, homosexuals began to come out of the closet and so forth. I mean, tremendous social revolution occurring in the 60s, specifically in the West. So what in the heck went on? Well, the historians say that people's values were liberalized. Right, but we ask, why were people's values liberalized back then and all of a sudden? And the story we tell about that is from infectious disease, of course, and change of values accordingly. So if you start with so you really got the liberalization in young people, like university age, college age, high school age, those kinds of people, young adults in the 60s, rather than the parents of those people. And so it was something that went on prior to these people's upbringing, right? A generation or two before. So if you start looking at that, there's a lot known about health issues, health interventions in the West, and you start off with chlorinated water, 1920. Okay. So add a little bit of chlorine to the water, and you kill basically all the infectious disease. And that spread very rapidly throughout the West. And this was not happening outside the West. So that's 1920s. Got that. Also in the 20s, there were laws that came along for garbage disposal for the first time, sewage disposal, a lot more indoor toilets hooked into the sewer system, the toilets. Food handling laws came along first in the 1920s. And so that was a tremendous health improvement, sanitation. And then you jump up to the 1940s, and you have child vaccination programs that started widespread in the West. You also have antibiotics coming out right at the end of World War II, 1945. Good antibiotics. There were some antibiotics before that, but they weren't very good, and the side effects were about as bad as the diseases, like with the sulfa drugs and so forth. But real good antibiotics, broad spectrum antibiotics, came out in 1945. Also, you had fluoridated water coming in 1945 too. Fluoridated water is very protective against a whole laundry list of mouth diseases. It not only reduces tooth cavities, but put a little fluoride in the water, and you protect people from lots of mouth diseases. So that was 1945. Then also in 1945, you had good insecticides coming along. All this is Western improvement coming out of science. Insecticides, DDT and other hydrocarbons, chlorinated hydrocarbons, and various other kinds of pesticides that worked against vectors, especially mosquitoes. About 1930, people began to put screens on their windows over here in the West to keep out mosquitoes. So that reduced malaria too. And malaria was basically controlled by mid-40s, 50s, in the West. And so all these health interventions were going on beginning in the 20s through the 40s. And then lo and behold, you got these young adults that were raised in a relatively disease-free environment compared to what had been the case before, who were liberals. So we use that as a very, very strong case for infectious disease being really important in the social revolution. And, the sexual revolution was part of that too, and the sexual revolution. So a liberalization of sexual attitudes and all. We've done some stuff on sexual attitudes across countries, and that correlates, of course, with liberalism. More liberalism, the more openness to sexual behavior. So that's a good case where you can tie, all this evidence on health interventions to a major cultural change. Something like that must have been going on with the Enlightenment and the other direction in terms of infectious disease, as you mentioned, for the Inquisition. So yeah, lots and lots of bubonic plague and associated misery with that. But if you got a lot of bubonic plague, you got a lot of other diseases too. It wasn't just bubonic plague. It was high levels of lots of infectious diseases. Bubonic plague is the most famous because it kills so many people, but and so dramatically killed these people. But there were other infectious diseases too, to get that high degree of conservatism that characterized the Catholic Church in the Inquisition, where, that's just extreme neophobia. That was against heretics. Okay, anybody that speaks negatively about the church will kill you, basically. And that's just neophobia. That's an expression of neophobia, which is extreme conservatism. Yeah. And with the Enlightenment, what you got. First of all, it's important to realize that these liberal things, the Enlightenment, the Glorious Revolution, those kinds of things going on at the same time, scientific revolution, all that occurred at high latitudes. Didn't occur at the equator. Okay, you're not going to get a scientific revolution at the equator still, or an enlightenment at the equator. That's high latitude, and that's all else equal. You got fewer parasites the higher the latitude. So parasites like it wet and warm, and so they do better at low latitudes than high. So all these things, but the details of the Enlightenment and so forth have not been looked at. And I imagine, if you look at just, if you Google in the Enlightenment and sanitation, what you see is the beginning of concern that people had about getting human waste piped out of the city. Okay? They put in some pipes and stuff. So you're beginning to get an effort in sanitation that I think, if some historians would take a look at that, they would find that the Enlightenment can be explained just like the Cultural Revolution of the 60s in the West. It's a simple disease situation, yeah. Emancipation from disease, yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yes, so I think that this is a very important discussion because people tend to think that it is values that cause people's behavior, but perhaps they don't tend to question where those values come from, and perhaps there's another line of causation, something that comes prior to the changing of values, and that in this case it is parasite-stress, and in other cases it might be other environmental aspects. But perhaps people tend to focus too much on purely mental things and very little on environmental circumstances, at least a lot of the time.
Right. Yeah, I agree. If you go through all of our evidence, you must, if you're objective, you're going to see that parasites are playing a much greater role than we knew before in explaining values. And we certainly haven't proposed that parasites are the only thing. There could be other things affecting values, but we think parasites have been overlooked and need to be very much in the minds of people who are interested in values, what the causes of values are. And, not only people who are interested in the causes of values from a scholarly point of view, but people who are interested in values from a humanitarian point of view, too. Our evidence says that if you want to make people more egalitarian, make them more liberal, make them less prejudiced, then you need to focus on emancipating people from parasites. And then you will begin to get people that grow up and are more liberal-minded and open to and less prejudice and so forth. Yeah.
Okay, so let's just tackle one last question before
Yep.
we finish the conversation here, that I think it's also a very interesting one, and it is not particularly focused on humans, but in all animal species in general, that has to do with this. So, again, about parasite stress. Would you say that this is another factor, that is the levels of exposure to infectious sources and pathogens and parasites, that this is another factor that we have to take into account in explaining, for example, how two different groups of the same species get separated and then perhaps develop Philopatry, and then eventually over time they end up speciating?
Yeah. Yeah. That's part of our research, actually, to look at the role of infectious disease in creating new species. I mentioned that we think infectious disease is creating new cultures. So you got this culture in one region, and you get, if that region is a high infectious disease region, then the infectious diseases, through their effects on values, will fractionate the original culture to the point where you get new cultures arising. We think it works the same way, basically, with creating new species and explaining the great variation in species numbers across the world. So ecologists have known, biologists have known a long time that there are a hell of a lot more species in the tropics than in temperate zones. And they've thought about why that is and all that kind of stuff, all kinds of crazy ideas. But basically, if you put the disease model into the picture, then I think that's very nicely explains that. Because what happens if you got a species over a geographic range, and that geographic range is in an area of high infectious disease, you get values in those species that are analogs of the human values we've talked about, that are analogs. And there's a lot of behavioral ecologists are looking at personality in fish and birds and all that, insects and so forth, and finding some interesting stuff that looks like these personality traits are analogs, really, of the kinds of behaviors you see associated with human values. So Philopatry and openness and aggressiveness and shyness and those kinds of things, introversion. You got that in fish and insects and mammals and so forth, So basically, under high infectious disease, you get this original species range fractionating, and then you get genetic discontinuities between these groups, all the way to reproductive isolation. Then you have new species, which explains, we feel, the strong latitudinal correlation in species number. There's another pattern in ecology that's been known a long time too, which is that species ranges are smaller in the tropics than in temperate zones. So that's comparable to our study I mentioned earlier in indigenous societies, where you get a small home range under high infectious disease thing, and that's a Philopatry kind of thing. So you get smaller ranges in these tropical species, just because they don't move as much, not as much dispersion. So we call this the speciation part of this story that we're talking about. We call that the parasite-driven wedge model of speciation, a new model of speciation. Yeah, driven by parasites. Yeah.
Okay, okay, very well. So, Dr. Thornhill, it was again really a pleasure to have you on the show. I think we've really got the opportunity here to break down all of the aspects that
Yeah.
are associated with parasite stress theory of values. And so, and perhaps, I mean, perhaps in the future we could do another interview, but then perhaps more focused on another aspect of your work that has to do with sex differences in humans. But since I've already had on the show people like Dr. David Buss, Richard Lipp, and others with whom I talked specifically about that, but perhaps with you we could talk about it more from, let's say, a phylogenetic standpoint and a comparative biological slash psychological
Okay.
standpoint.
Okay. Well, let's keep that in mind then. Yeah.
Okay, okay. So, Dr. Thornhill, again, thank you a lot for taking the time to come on the show. It was
Thank
really a
you.
pleasure.
I enjoyed it very much. Bye bye.
Hi everybody, thank you a lot for watching this interview until the end, and also, by the way, for coming to my channel. As you might have noticed, I've started this channel in February 2018 and have been putting out regular interviews with academics and intellectuals from a variety of fields. To keep this channel sustainable, I would like to ask you to please visit my Patreon page and to consider making a pledge. Any amount, even if just $1, would already be a great help. Otherwise, and if you like what I'm doing, please share it, leave a like, and hit the subscription button. I would also like to give a huge thank you to my patrons Karen Litzke, Anne Blanchett, Per Helga Larsen, Lau Guerrero, Chantel Gelina, Jim Frank, Francis Ford, and Hans Frederick Sunda. Thank you for all.